At Los Alamos, passes were checked, badges controlled movement, visitor lists were kept, and even private correspondence fell under censorship. The site had been chosen for isolation precisely because officials believed remoteness could protect the bomb. Yet one of the most damaging atomic leaks did not come through a fence line or a break-in. It came from people who already belonged there. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. American security around the bomb was real, extensive, and in many ways, severe. But it was built to stop intruders more easily than it could detect trusted insiders. And when clues did appear, they were scattered across separate investigations, separate cities, and separate kinds of evidence. The Manhattan Project was organized around separation. Work was divided by task, by site, and by clearance. Los Alamos handled the design and assembly problem in a remote New Mexico setting. New York and Washington mattered in different ways. Administration, military direction, intelligence traffic, investigative paperwork. The logic was simple enough. If no one person saw too much, then fewer secrets could escape. On paper, Los Alamos looked formidable. Official project history describes passes for everyone on site, badges tied to particular areas, maintained visitor lists, and censorship of correspondence introduced in December 1943. This was not casual wartime secrecy. It was systematic, and the choice of Los Alamos itself reflected that mindset. General Leslie Groves and J. Robert Oppenheimer selected an isolated mesa in part because distance, limited access, and physical control seemed to offer obvious security advantages. But remoteness is not the same thing as certainty. The weakness lay in the people who were allowed through the system rather than outside it. Scientists, technicians, soldiers, clerks, couriers, family members all occupied different positions inside the project's machinery. Compartmentalization reduced what any one person should know. It also meant that signs of trouble could remain local, partial, and oddly unconnected. A suspicious contact in one place, a fragment of technical information in another, a coded Soviet message somewhere else. Each might exist in a file without immediately changing policy. The official history of project security even notes that infractions occurred, though many were minor. That detail matters because it strips away the later myth of perfect control. The atomic program was guarded intensely, but it was also a wartime enterprise assembled at speed, spread across institutions, and reliant on individuals whose loyalty was assumed once access had been granted. That is where the story of atomic espionage properly begins. Theodore Hall has to be treated separately. Released NSA material identifies Hall as the source codenamed MLAD in Venona-related documents, and the FBI later maintained a separate file on him. That alone changes the shape of the episode. Hall was not simply a loose extension of the courtroom drama that later fixed public attention on the Rosenbergs. He belongs to the atomic espionage story in his own right, through a different evidentiary trail. The public memory of the case was formed in court, while some of the most revealing intelligence evidence became public only decades later. According to the NSA's history of the Venona project, the first public release came in July 1995, and roughly 3,000 translations were eventually declassified and made public. By then, the names involved had long since been absorbed into a different, more compressed narrative. David Greenglass occupies another position entirely. In the FBI's own public account of the Rosenberg case, He is a central witness and source on the transfer of atomic information. The Bureau states that Greenglass described efforts by Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to obtain bomb-related information, that he prepared material for Julius Rosenberg, and that he later handed material to Harry Gold, who was tied to Soviet handling. For the public prosecution story, Greenglass is indispensable. His role belongs to the prosecutorial record, where testimony, interrogation, and corroboration were used to build a case fit for court. Hall's role sits more heavily in the intelligence archive, especially the later reading of Soviet traffic and subsequent identification. The Rosenbergs stand between those worlds. They are part of the larger espionage narrative. So, when people speak of the atom spies, they are usually collapsing several different channels into one label. An insider physicist at Los Alamos, a military machinist with family ties, intermediaries such as Harry Gold, and a couple whose case became one of the defining legal and political dramas of the early Cold War. That collapse is understandable. It is also misleading. The point is not to dissolve responsibility into ambiguity. It is to keep the roles straight. Hall was not Greenglass. Greenglass was not simply a synonym for the Rosenbergs, and the evidence for each figure did not arrive in the same form or at the same time. The American government did uncover the network, but not while it was fully alive and legible to itself. It reconstructed it. The FBI's own chronology is stark on this point. According to the Bureau, the atomic spy investigation began in 1949. The chain then ran from Klaus Fuchs to Harry Gold, from Gold to David Greenglass, and only after interrogations of Greenglass and Ruth Greenglass did investigators connect Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to espionage activity. This is not the chronology of an agency watching the whole network in real time. It is the chronology of a puzzle solved in stages, after arrests, confessions, and accumulating pressure. Venona was crucial, but even here, caution is necessary. NSA's own history of the project makes clear that decrypted Soviet traffic did not always yield immediate certainty. Some identities were matched to cover names only later, with the help of analysis and investigation. That is why it is safer to say that Venona illuminated the atomic espionage story than to claim that it answered every question by itself. There is a practical reason for that. Intelligence traffic is fragmentary by nature. A cable may preserve a code name, a meeting, a technical description, a place, but not the whole human context. Investigators then have to match that fragment to a person, a route, a date, a prior interview, a surveillance lead. If one part is missing, the document remains suggestive rather than final. This is also why the Hall story and the Rosenberg story did not emerge in the same public forum. Venona-related identification of Hall as MLAD belongs to a later declassified intelligence record. The Rosenberg prosecution belonged to a courtroom world of witnesses, charges, testimony, and political consequence in the early 1950s. The two overlap, but they are not identical records, and they do not answer questions in the same register. By the time much of the relevant Venona material became public in the mid-1990s, the argument had already been shaped by decades of legal controversy, Cold War polemic, and family testimony. So what exactly did American counterintelligence miss? Not every clue, not every suspect. The failure was broader and more specific than that. Separate clues existed, but they were not assembled into a complete and timely understanding of how insider access, courier channels, family links, and Soviet handling fit together while the wartime and immediate post-war story was still unfolding. Taken together, the official record is stronger than the oldest simplified arguments on either side. The Manhattan Project was not carelessly open. It was guarded through badges, passes, censorship, and isolation. Atomic secrets, nevertheless, moved outward through insiders. The FBI did not uncover the whole pattern as it happened, but reconstructed major parts of it later. Venona became one of the most important pieces of that reconstruction, though not a magical key that eliminated every uncertainty. The evidence supports speaking of a broader atomic espionage story in which Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, intermediaries such as Harry Gold, and the Rosenbergs appear in related but distinct roles. It does not support treating every role as equal, every source as identical, or every disputed detail as settled beyond argument. In practice, this means keeping two thoughts in view at once. One is that Soviet access to American atomic information was real and consequential. The other is that the route by which historians now know that story combines courtroom testimony, FBI investigation, decrypted Soviet communications, and later archival release. The case has often been remembered as a morality play with fixed parts: traitors, investigators, a national secret, a final verdict. It shows a wartime system that looked secure and still leaked, an investigation that found enough to prosecute some figures but not to grasp the whole pattern at once, and an intelligence record that became clearer only decades after the central drama had already passed into public myth. That may be the most durable lesson here. The American atomic state was built on secrecy, but secrecy also fragmented understanding. It protected information from many outsiders while making it harder to see what trusted insiders were doing across institutional boundaries. By the time the fragments could be read together, the bomb had already changed the world, and the history of who helped that knowledge travel had become far harder to tell plainly. What failed in this story was not security in the simplest sense. Guards stood where they were supposed to stand. Documents were controlled, mail was censored, and access was restricted. The deeper failure was that a system designed to divide knowledge also divided perception. It could protect secrets and still failed to recognize in time how several insiders and intermediaries formed a working channel out of the most protected project in American history. That is why the Rosenberg-era atom spy case still resists easy retelling. Once Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, the Rosenbergs, FBI chronology, and Venona are placed side by side, the old single-story version no longer quite holds. In its place stands something more unsettling and more historically credible. Not one betrayal seen clearly from the start, but a network understood late, through fragments. Subscribe to discover more hidden stories and fatal decisions that changed the course of history.